two young bullies ripped a veteran's inhaler from his hands during an asthma attack, convinced no one would intervene, but they didn't realize the Royal Guard had been silently watching. What happened next stunned the entire crowd. Here's how it all unfolded. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe, because tomorrow, at this same time, we'll bring you another powerful story of courage and discipline from the Royal Guards you won't want to miss. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace like a whisper from centuries past. October had painted London in shades of amber and gold, and the crisp air carried the promise of winter's approach. Standing motionless at his post, Corporal James Ashford cut an imposing figure against the backdrop of Britain's most iconic residence. His scarlet tunic, pristine despite the early hour, bore the weight of tradition that stretched back through generations of guardsmen who had stood where he now stood. At 28, Ashford had already served 2 tours in Afghanistan before, earning his place among the elite ceremonial guards. His steel-grey eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of his towering bearskin hat, missed nothing. Every tourist's camera flash, every passing vehicle, every shift in the crowd's energy, all catalogued with the precision of a man trained to spot danger in the chaos of combat. The palace grounds hummed with the usual morning activity. Tours, groups clustered around the gates, their guides recounting tales of royal history, while children pressed their faces against the iron bars, hoping for a glimpse of something magical. Street vendors hawked their wares from nearby corners, the aroma of fresh coffee and warm pastries mixing with the exhaust fumes of London's awakening traffic. But there was something else in the air that morning, something that made Ashford's trained instincts prickle with unease. Perhaps it was the way certain individuals moved through the crowd, their eyes scanning not for photo opportunities but for something else entirely. Or maybe it was simply the weight of experience, the sixth sense that combat veterans develop after too many close calls in hostile territory. Whatever it was, Corporal Ashford remained alert, his breathing steady and controlled, his posture perfect, despite having stood motionless for nearly 2 hours. This was his duty, his honor, and he would not fail in it. 300 yards from where Ashford maintained his vigil, Jonathan Cooper was beginning what should have been a peaceful morning walk. At 65, the retired RAF squadron leader still carried himself with the bearing of a military man, though the years had etched their stories across his weathered face. His medals, the Distinguished Flying Cross among them, caught the morning light as he made his way toward the palace grounds, a route he'd taken countless times since retiring to his modest flat in nearby Pimlico. Cooper's morning routine had become sacred to him. After losing his wife Margaret to cancer 2 years prior, these walks provided structure to days that otherwise felt endless. The sight of the palace, the changing of the guard, the reminder of service and duty, these things anchored him to a world that sometimes felt like it was moving too fast for an old pilot to keep up. But this morning was different. As Cooper approached his usual bench near the palace gates, he noticed 2 young men loitering nearby. They couldn't have been more than 25, both wearing tracksuits and sporting the kind of aggressive posturing that made Cooper's military instincts twitch. Greg Thornton and Danny Mills, though Cooper didn't know their names yet, had been prowling the tourist areas for weeks, looking for easy marks. Greg, the taller of the two with a spiderweb tattoo creeping up his neck, nudged his companion as he spotted Cooper approaching. "Look at this old fool," he muttered, his voice carrying the harsh accent of London's rougher neighborhoods. "Thinks he's still somebody important with those shiny medals." Danny, shorter but stockier, with knuckles already scarred from previous altercations, grinned with malicious anticipation. "Yeah, let's see how tough Grandpa really is." Cooper sensed the tension but pressed on. At his age, he'd learned to pick his battles, and 2 young thugs weren't worth changing his routine. He'd faced down MiG fighters over the Falklands. He certainly wasn't going to be intimidated by street punks in Tractis. He sixed as he settled onto his bench. Cooper felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had plagued him since his service days. The asthma had started after his crash in '82, when he'd inhaled too much smoke and seawater during his harrowing ejection over the South Atlantic. The doctors had told him it was a miracle he'd survived at all, but the miracle had come with a price. Lungs that no longer worked quite the way they should. The attack began subtly, as these things often do. Greg and Danny positioned themselves on either side of Cooper's bench, their presence immediately making the elderly veteran uncomfortable. Other tourists, sensing the brewing tension, began to drift away, that peculiar urban instinct for self-preservation kicking in. "Nice medals, old man," Greg said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Where'd you steal those from?" Cooper's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward, watching the palace gates, where he could see the motionless figure of Corporal Ashford. "They're not stolen," he replied quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd once commanded fighter squadrons. "Oh, we got ourselves a hero here," Danny chimed in, moving closer. "What did you do? Sit behind a desk somewhere safe, while real men did the fighting?" The words hit Cooper like a physical blow. His mind flashed back to May 21st, 1982, when his Harrier jump jet had been hit by Argentine ground fire during a close air support mission. He could still remember the screaming of the engines, the smell of burning fuel, the violent ejection. That had probably saved his life but left him with injuries that would plague him for decades. "I served my country," Cooper said, his voice steady despite the growing tightness in his chest. "In the Falklands, in Northern Ireland, in Shut Up, you old liar," Greg snarled, abandoning any pretense of civility. "Nobody cares about your war stories." The stress of the confrontation was triggering Cooper's asthma. His breathing became labored, each intake of air a struggle. He reached into his jacket pocket for his inhaler, the same blue Ventolin device that had been his constant companion for over 40 years. His fingers, normally steady despite his age, trembled as he tried to activate it. Danny noticed the inhaler immediately. "What's this then?" The old man's got himself a little toy. Before Cooper could react, Danny's hand shot out and snatched the inhaler away. "Please," Cooper gasped, his face beginning to pale as his airways constricted. "I need that. I can't breathe without can't breathe." Greg laughed, a sound devoid of any human warmth. "Well, maybe you should have thought of that before you started lying to us about being some kind of war hero." The crowd around them had thinned considerably, but those who remained watched in horror as the situation escalated. A few pulled out their phones, but none stepped forward to help. This was London, after all, where everyone had learned to mind their own business. From his post 300 yards away, Corporal Ashford watched the developing situation with growing concern. His training had taught him to remain motionless during ceremonial duties, to be a living statue representing the unchanging nature of British tradition. But that same training had also taught him to recognize danger, to assess threats, and to act when necessary. Ashford's eyes tracked the two young men as they circled the elderly veteran like predators stalking wounded prey. He could see the man's distress, the way his shoulders hunched as he struggled to breathe. The glint of medals on the man's coat told a story that Ashford, as a fellow serviceman, understood intimately. The royalguards weren't just ceremonial fixtures, despite what tourists might think. Each man standing at those gates was a highly trained soldier, selected from elite regiments and capable of switching from ceremonial duties to combat readiness in a heartbeat. Ashford himself had served with the Coldstream Guards in Afghanistan, where he'd learned that sometimes the difference between life and death came down to split-second decisions. As he watched, Danny held the inhaler high above his head, taunting the gasping veteran. "You want this back, old man? Maybe if you get down on your knees and beg like the pathetic dog you are." Cooper's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His face had taken on an alarming grayish pallor, and his breathing had become a series of desperate wheezes. The veteran struggled to his feet, reaching for his walking stick, but Greg kicked it away with casual cruelty. "Look at him," Greg sneered to his companion. "The mighty war hero can't even stand up without his little stick." That's when Cooper collapsed. The elderly veteran dropped to one knee, his hand clutching his chest as he fought for air that wouldn't come. The medals on his coat caught the morning light as he swayed, struggling to remain conscious. For a moment, the square fell silent, except for the horrible sound of a man slowly suffocating. "Please," Cooper whispered, his voice barely audible. "Falklands 82, I served, ... I served my country, ... The words hit Ashford like a physical blow. Falklands 82. The corporal knew his military history, knew about the brave pilots who'd flown impossible missions against overwhelming odds, who'd faced down Argentine fighters and ground fire to support British ground forces. Many of those pilots hadn't come home. This man had, but he'd clearly paid a price for his service. The situation reached its breaking point when Danny, emboldened by the crowd's inaction, raised his fist to strike the helpless veteran. Cooper, still struggling to breathe, looked up with eyes that had seen too much war, too much loss, too much cruelty. But there was no surrender in that gaze, only the quiet dignity of a man who'd faced death before and wasn't afraid to face it again. Time seemed to slow as Danny's fist began its descent. In that frozen moment, Ashford made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Duty to the crown was absolute, but duty to a fellow serviceman, especially one being brutalized by cowards, superseded everything else. The corporal moved with the fluid precision of a man trained in close-quarters combat. In 3 powerful strides, he covered the distance between his post and the confrontation, his rifle held at the ready. The tourists scattered, some screaming, others frantically recording the unfolding drama on their phones. Ashford's rifle came up in a defensive position just as Danny's fist reached its target. The metallic clang of the weapon blocking the blow echoed across the square like a gunshot. Danny stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock and sudden fear. "On your knees." Now Ashford's voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded respect in some of the most dangerous places on earth. It wasn't loud, but it carried across the square with unmistakable menace. Greg, seeing his companion's attack blocked, made the crucial mistake of lunging at the guardsman. Ashford's response was swift and devastating. His rifle came around in a controlled arc, the butt connecting with Greg's solar plexus and dropping him to his knees, gasping for air. Before Danny could react, Ashford had grabbed his wrist and applied a textbook military restraint hold that had the young thug crying out in pain. "Drop it," Ashford commanded, referring to the inhaler still clutched in Danny's other hand. "Drop it now or I'll break your wrist." Danny, tears streaming down his face from the pain, released the inhaler. Ashford caught it smoothly and, without breaking his hold on the criminal, kicked it precisely across the pavement to where Cooper knelt, struggling for breath. The veteran's hands shook as he fumbled with the device, but muscle memory took over. 2 quick puffs, then a third, and finally his airways began to open. Color slowly returned to his face as life-giving oxygen reached his lungs. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Word of the incident had spread quickly through the tourist crowds, and multiple people had called emergency services. But even as help approached, Ashford maintained his position, keeping both attackers subdued while ensuring Cooper received the medical attention he desperately needed. A paramedic team arrived first, their practiced efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos of moments before. They immediately began assessing Cooper's condition, checking his oxygen levels and providing additional breathing treatments. The veteran's vital signs were stabilizing, but it was clear he'd come dangerously close to a full respiratory arrest. "You're going to be fine, sir," the lead paramedic assured Cooper as they prepared to transport him to the nearest hospital for observation. "Your breathing is improving, and your oxygen saturation is back within normal ranges." Cooper, finally, able to speak without gasping, looked up at Ashford with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, son. Thank you for seeing me." The words carried more weight than mere gratitude. Cooper had served in an era when military service was honored, when veterans were welcomed home as heroes. But times had changed, and too often now, elderly veterans felt invisible, forgotten by a society that had moved on from their sacrifices. As the paramedics loaded Cooper into the ambulance, the police arrived to deal with Greg and Danny. The 2 attackers, no longer the swaggering bullies they'd been minutes before, were cuffed and read their rights. The crowd of tourists, which had scattered during the confrontation, began to reassemble, many of them filming the arrest with their phones. Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, took charge of the scene. She'd seen enough street violence to recognize the signs of a hate crime when she saw one, and the targeting of an elderly veteran for his military service definitely qualified. "Corporal Ashford," she said, approaching the guardsman who had resumed his ceremonial position, "I'll need to speak with you about what happened here." Ashford's response was measured, professional. "I observed 2 individuals attacking an elderly gentleman who was clearly in medical distress. They had taken his medication and were preventing him from accessing it. I intervened to protect a fellow serviceman." The investigation that followed revealed far more than anyone had expected. Greg Thornton and Danny Mills weren't just random thugs looking for easy targets. They were part of a growing trend of violence against elderly veterans in London. Their arrest records, which Detective Inspector Morrison reviewed that afternoon, painted a disturbing picture of escalating aggression. Greg had been arrested twice in the past year for assault, both times targeting elderly men. His first victim had been an 80-year-old former Royal Navy sailor who'd been attacked while visiting the Imperial War Museum. The second was a 73-year-old Army veteran who'd been beaten unconscious after leaving a Remembrance Day ceremony. Danny's record was even more troubling. He'd been involved in 3 separate incidents targeting veterans, including one where he'd stolen a Purple Heart from a visiting American serviceman. The pattern was clear. These weren't random crimes but targeted attacks on those who'd served their country. "It's becoming an epidemic," Morrison explained to her supervisor later that day. "These criminals are specifically targeting veterans, often elderly ones who can't fight back. They see the medals, the military bearing, and it triggers something violent in them." The detective's words would prove prophetic. Within hours of the arrest, news of the incident had spread across social media. Video footage captured by tourists showed the entire confrontation, from the initial attack to Ashford's intervention. The response was immediate and overwhelming. #Justice for Veterans began trending on Twitter within hours. The video of Cooper being attacked and Ashford's heroic intervention was shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from around the world, many from veterans who shared their own stories of harassment and assault. But the social media attention also revealed something else. This wasn't an isolated incident. Veterans organizations across the UK began reporting similar attacks, many of which had gone unreported or were dismissed as random street crime. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Cooper himself, recovering in St. Thomas Hospital, was stunned by the attention. Reporters had gathered outside his room, all wanting to speak with the hero of the Falklands, who'd been saved by a royal guard. But Cooper wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in justice, not just for himself but for all the veterans who'd suffered in silence. The court hearing for Greg Thornton and Danny Mills was scheduled for the following week, but their defense attorney was already preparing what would prove to be a disastrous strategy. Rather than showing remorse for the attack, the lawyer planned to argue that his clients were the real victims, young men from disadvantaged backgrounds, who'd been unfairly targeted by an overzealous security system. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Judge Margaret Henley, herself the daughter of a World War II veteran, listened to the defense's arguments with barely concealed disgust. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of decades on the bench. These defendants specifically targeted Mr. Cooper because of his military service, she stated firmly. They saw his medals, recognized him as a veteran, and decided to humiliate and assault him. This was not a random crime, it was a hate crime, plain and simple. The evidence was overwhelming. The tourist videos showed clearly that Greg and Danny had focused on Cooper's medals from the beginning, taunting him about his service record. Witnesses testified that they'd heard the attackers specifically mock Cooper's military background before the assault escalated. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from the defendants themselves. During police interviews, both men had made statements that revealed their deep-seated hostility toward veterans. Greg had described military service as a joke, while Danny had expressed the belief that veterans were living off past glory and deserved to be brought down to size. The judge sentenced both men to 18 months in prison, followed by community service that would include mandatory work with veterans organizations. The sentence sent a clear message: attacks on those who'd served their country would not be tolerated. Cooper, still recovering from his ordeal, attended the sentencing hearing. As he watched his attackers led away in handcuffs, he felt not satisfaction but sadness. These were young men who'd somehow learned to hate those who'd served their country, a perversion of values that spoke to deeper problems in society. The aftermath of the incident continued to reverberate through British society long after the court case ended. The video of Ashford's intervention had gone viral internationally, drawing attention not just to the attack, but to the broader issue of veteran harassment. News outlets across the globe picked up the story, using it as a launching point for investigations into how veterans were treated in their home countries. The response from the British government was swift and decisive. Prime Minister's questions the following week were dominated by discussions of veteran welfare, with MPs from both sides of the aisle calling for increased protection for those who'd served. Within a month, new legislation was introduced that would classify attacks on veterans as hate crimes, carrying enhanced penalties. But the real change came from the public response. The Royal British Legion, the UK's largest veterans organisation, reported a massive surge in membership and donations following the incident. Young people, many of whom had never considered military service before, began reaching out to veterans organisations to volunteer their time and support. Ashford himself became something of a reluctant celebrity. The Household Division, which oversees the royalguards, initially considered disciplinary action for his departure from his post, but public pressure, combined with support from the royal family themselves, led to a different outcome. Instead of punishment, Ashford was commended for his actions and became a poster child for the values that the Guards represented. "Corporal Ashford exemplifies everything we stand for," said Colonel James Whitmore, commanding officer of the Coldstream Guards. He showed that being a guardian of tradition doesn't mean being blind to injustice. When a fellow serviceman needed help, he acted with courage and honor. The incident also led to changes in how ceremonial guards were trained and deployed. New protocols were established that gave guards more discretion to intervene in emergency situations while maintaining their ceremonial duties. The rigid interpretation of standing motionless was replaced with a more nuanced understanding of what it meant to serve and protect. Cooper, meanwhile, had found new purpose in his unexpected fame. Rather than retreating into private life, he began speaking at schools and community centers about his experiences, both as a veteran and as a victim of hate crime. His message was simple but powerful. Service to country was an honor, not a source of shame, and those who'd served deserved respect, not ridicule. 1 year after the incident, Cooper and Ashford met again at Buckingham Palace for a ceremony honoring both men. Cooper had been invited to participate in a special commemoration of Falklands veterans, while Ashford was being recognized for his exemplary service to the Crown. The two men, separated by nearly 4 decades in age but united by their commitment to service, stood together as the Queen's representative presented their awards. Cooper received the Queen's Commendation for bravery, recognizing not just his military service but his courage in the face of attack. Ashford was awarded the Royal Victorian Medal for his actions in protecting a fellow serviceman. "You saved my life that day," Cooper said to Ashford as they posed for photographs after the ceremony. "But more than that, you saved my dignity. You showed me that my service still mattered, that someone was still watching out for old soldiers like me." Ashford, still uncomfortable with the attention, simply nodded. "It was my duty, sir. We look after our own." The ceremony was covered by media outlets around the world, but the real story wasn't the pomp and circumstance. It was the friendship that had developed between the two men, the mutual respect that transcended generational differences. Cooper had become a mentor to Ashford, sharing stories of his service and helping the younger man understand the weight of tradition he carried. Ashford, in turn, had given Cooper a renewed sense of purpose and pride in his military service. The incident had also led to lasting changes in how British society treated its veterans. The enhanced penalties for attacks on servicemen and women had been implemented, and there had been a marked decrease in reported incidents of veteran harassment. More importantly, public awareness of the challenges faced by elderly veterans had led to increased support services and community programs. As the ceremony concluded and the two men prepared to return to their respective lives, they made a pact. They would continue to speak out about veteran issues to ensure that what happened that October morning would never be forgotten. Their story had become more than just a tale of one man's courage. It had become a reminder that honor, duty, and service to others were values worth defending, no matter the cost. The morning mist had long since lifted from the palace grounds, but the memory of that fateful day remained crystal clear. In a world that often seemed to have forgotten the value of service and sacrifice, two men had shown that heroism wasn't just about grand gestures or battlefield glory. Sometimes it was simply about standing up for what was right, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and remembering that true honor never stands down. The story of Corporal James Ashford and squadron leader Jonathan Cooper became a testament to the enduring bonds between those who serve, a reminder that the values of duty, honor, and courage transcend rank, age, and circumstance. Their legacy would inspire a new generation of Britons to look after their veterans, to honor their service, and to ensure that no one who had served their country would ever stand alone in their hour of need. As the sun set over London that day, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, the message was clear. Honor never stands down, and those who serve are never forgotten.